We are living in an era of unprecedented geopolitical blindness, where the custodians of Western strategy appear to have forgotten the foundational grammar of the nuclear age. For decades, global stability was preserved not by moral consensus or international law, but by a cold, calculating fear of total annihilation. Today, that fear has been replaced by a staggering level of hubris within Western capitals, a collective delusion that red lines are mere rhetorical bluffs, and that a nuclear-armed superpower can be systematically backed into a corner without consequence. Pause twos. What we are witnessing in the ongoing conflict in Ukraine is not just a localized war, but a dangerous breakdown of the traditional mechanisms of deterrence. The West has convinced itself that it can orchestrate a slow, measured degradation of Russian power, managing the escalation ladder like a corporate ledger. But this is a profound miscalculation. The underlying reality is far more volatile, driven by internal political pressures within the Kremlin and a growing school of thought among Russian strategists that the only way to restore deterrence is through a dramatic, demonstrative act of force. My thesis is straightforward yet deeply unsettling. The Western establishment is playing a game of chicken with a state that views the conflict as existential, completely ignoring the internal mechanisms that drive great power behavior. Within Russia itself, a dangerous narrative is taking root. Contrary to the simplistic Western portrayal of Vladimir Putin as an absolute, unconstrained autocrat, he is facing significant and mounting pressure from within his own domestic establishment. And emphasis. Insiders, military officials, and high-level figures within the political apparatus are growing increasingly resentful of what they perceive as a policy of restraint. They argue that the Russian leadership is holding its own forces on a leash, forcing an incremental inch-by-inch campaign when a decisive blow is required. Why has the Kremlin allowed this conflict to drag on without establishing clear, unalterable boundaries for Western involvement? This internal pressure is pushing the Russian presidency toward a more aggressive stance, dismantling the Western assumption that Putin is the most radical actor in the room. In reality, he may well be the principal force of moderation within the Russian elite, and if he is forced to appease his internal critics, the response will be cataclysmic. To understand how we reach this precipice, we must examine how thoroughly the unwritten rules of the Cold War have been shredded. During that decades-long standoff between Washington and Moscow, certain actions were deemed absolutely unthinkable. Neither superpower would dream of directly sponsoring or facilitating an invasion of the other's sovereign territory, nor would they target the essential components of the other's strategic stability. Yet, in the late summer of 2024, the world witnessed the Kursk offensive, a direct Ukrainian incursion into Mother Russia, actively supported by American and British intelligence, logistics, and hardware. How did Western policymakers convince themselves that violating the sovereign soil of a nuclear superpower was a safe tactical maneuver? Pause twos. Even more astonishing was the targeting of Russia's strategic nuclear triad, specifically the bomber forces that comprise one of the three pillars of its ultimate deterrent. During the Cold War, such an action would have triggered immediate mobilization and pushed the world to the brink of midnight. Today, it is treated in Western capitals as just another Tuesday on the battlefield, a clever asymmetric strike to be applauded in press briefings. This cavalier attitude stems from a fundamental misunderstanding of Russian strategic doctrine and a complete disregard for the psychological realities of power. Prominent Russian strategists, such as Sergei Karaganov, a figure I have known since the Cold War and who commands significant intellectual respect within Moscow, have openly argued that the West has lost its collective mind. They assert that Western elites have become so detached from the realities of a nuclear world that they believe they can slap Russia around with impunity. Karaganov's diagnosis is as chilling as it is logically coherent within the framework of realist geopolitics. When an adversary no longer respects your deterrent, the only way to rectify the situation is to shock them back into reality. His proposed solution is not a massive first strike to win a war, but a limited demonstrative use of a few tactical nuclear weapons. The explicit goal is to focus the minds of Western leaders, to shatter their illusion of safety, and to force them to realize that the slippery slope to total incineration is real. Are Western leaders genuinely prepared to test whether this logic is a bluff, or have they simply become incapable of understanding the minds of their adversaries? The tragedy of contemporary Western statecraft is its total lack of strategic empathy, replacing rigorous calculation with moralizing platitudes and wishful thinking. The core of this delusion lies in the Western inability to read the structural shifts occurring within the global security architecture. Consider the changing political landscape in Washington and its profound impact on the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. We are witnessing an era where the transatlantic relationship is not merely fraying, it is being systematically dismantled from within. The political factions aligned with Donald Trump have made no secret of their desire to eviscerate the traditional commitments that have bound American security to Western Europe since the end of the Second World War. As Washington signals its intent to move away from NATO, a highly volatile vacuum is created. The European powers, accustomed to decades of geopolitical freeloading under the American nuclear umbrella, suddenly find themselves structurally isolated. This shift plays directly into the strategic calculations of the Russian high command. When American security is no longer seamlessly tied to European security, the traditional calculus of extended deterrence collapses entirely. How can a continent that has hollowed out its own conventional forces expect to maintain a credible posture when its primary patron is openly looking for the exit? This structural decoupling fundamentally alters the risk threshold for Moscow, making a decisive counter-escalation far more plausible than Western analysts care to admit. This political fracturing is compounded by an even more stark, undeniable reality: the absolute depletion of Western military-industrial capacity. For over 2 years, Western elites have treated their stockpiles as an inexhaustible reservoir, funneling billions of dollars worth of sophisticated hardware into the Ukrainian theater. The result has been the creation of a vast graveyard of Western technology on the battlefields of Eastern Europe. Thousands of armored vehicles, advanced artillery pieces, and long-range precision munitions have been ground to dust. Most critically, the West has severely depleted its own air defense architectures. The transfer of premium assets, such as the Patriot PAC-3 anti-aircraft missile systems, has hollowed out the domestic defenses of both European nations and the United States. To make matters worse, Washington's global commitments have forced it to further draw down these finite resources, deploying critical air defense assets to volatile theaters like Iran and the broader Middle East to manage secondary crises. Are we truly expected to believe that a global superpower can fight a proxy war in Europe, secure the Middle East, and contain a rising Asia simultaneously with a completely depleted industrial base? The Kremlin, despite the propaganda broadcast by Western media networks, is fully capable of performing basic mathematical calculations. Russian planners look across the border and see an alliance whose actual defensive capacity is vastly inferior to what it was a mere 3 years ago. While the West has been burning through its existing inventories with no immediate mechanism for domestic replacement, Russia has transitioned its society onto a permanent war footing. For years now, their state-directed industrial apparatus has been operating around the clock, expanding manufacturing facilities, securing supply chains, and building massive inventories of everything from basic artillery shells to advanced hypersonic missiles. This severe asymmetry in industrial capacity creates a dangerous temptation. The Russian leadership sees a window of vulnerability where Western defense production cannot keep pace with the rate of consumption on the battlefield. This disparity does not mean Moscow intends to launch a grand conventional invasion to conquer Western Europe. Rather, it informs their calculation of risk. It gives them the confidence to know that if they choose to climb the escalation ladder, the West lacks the material depth and the political will to sustain a prolonged, high-intensity conflict. This brings us back to the chilling logic governing the strategic debates within Moscow. The underlying objective is not military conquest in the traditional sense, but the forced re-establishment of geopolitical boundaries. When figures like Karaganov advocate for a dramatic shift in policy, they are operating on the premise that Western hubris can only be cured by a profound psychological shock. They see a Western elite that has become entirely desensitized to conventional warnings, treating every Russian diplomatic statement as empty posturing. If the West believes that Russia's red lines are meaningless, then the existing diplomatic and conventional mechanisms of communication have failed. Emphasis. In the cold calculus of realism, when words lose their meaning, force must take their place. The debate inside Russia is no longer about whether to escalate, but how to execute that escalation in a way that maximizes psychological impact while minimizing the risk of immediate global annihilation. How did Western policymakers allow themselves to become so detached from the reality of power that they have made a nuclear demonstration look like the only logical option left for their adversary? The global order is shifting, and the material and political foundations that once guaranteed Western supremacy are rapidly washing away, leaving behind a highly unstable world where the old rules no longer apply. To truly grasp the gravity of this situation, one must understand that Western strategic thinkers are suffering from a dangerous form of cognitive dissonance. They look at the conflict and see a traditional war of attrition, convinced that if they simply pour enough weapons and financial aid into the theater, they can engineer a total Russian defeat. Certain military figures in the West routinely broadcast the delusion that the tide is turning and that Russia can be broken conventionally. But what they fail to comprehend or choose to ignore is that the closer they think they are to achieving this goal, the closer they are pushing the world to nuclear reality. Pause twos. In the unyielding logic of great power politics, a nuclear-armed state whose leadership views the conflict as existential will never accept a conventional defeat that threatens its survival. If the Russian state is backed into a corner where its core security architecture is on the verge of collapse, it will not wave a white flag. It will turn to its ultimate equalizer. Why are Western elites so incapable of understanding that their version of victory is the precise catalyst for global catastrophe? This brings us to the core mechanism of the strategy currently being debated within Moscow's intellectual circles, the concept of demonstrative escalation. It is critical to differentiate this from a grand operational strategy designed to win a war through sheer destructive force. When analysts contemplate the deployment of force, they are not talking about launching a massive first-strike nuclear campaign to vaporize Western capitals. That is a cartoonish misunderstanding of strategic doctrine. Instead, the intent is strictly communicative and coercive. It is a violent, unambiguous signal designed to demonstrate a willingness to ascend the escalation ladder to its absolute peak, leaving the final choice of disaster or survival entirely in the hands of the adversary. It is a stark notification that says your last clear chance to avoid total destruction rests with you, and you must cease and desist immediately. This strategic maneuver relies on a concept articulated during the height of the 20th century standoffs, the idea of deliberately throwing both sides onto a slippery slope. By executing a limited, highly controlled strike, a state effectively removes the brakes from the geopolitical vehicle. It introduces an element of profound uncertainty, signaling to the opponent that the situation is about to spin completely out of control and that neither side can accurately predict or manage the resulting dynamics. Emphasis. We must remember an unsettling truth. Humanity has never witnessed a high-intensity conflict involving nuclear weapons between two adversarial nuclear-armed states. We have absolutely no empirical data, no historical precedents, and no established rules of engagement for how such an escalation unfolds. By introducing force at this level, Russia would be forcing the West to look directly into the abyss of the unknown, wagering that the sudden, terrifying realization of impending annihilation will finally break the spell of Western hubris. However, before the threshold of tactical nuclear deployment is even crossed, there's an intermediate, highly dangerous step that is increasingly viewed as a viable, preemptive measure. This involves launching conventional precision missile strikes against specific military installations inside NATO territory itself, most notably targeting logistics nodes and infrastructure in countries like Poland or Romania. The strategic logic behind such a move is to create an undeniable crisis that forces an immediate reassessment in Washington and European capitals. The message accompanying such strikes would be explicit. This is a conventional attack, but if you choose to retaliate, the next step is unmistakably nuclear. This forces the Western alliance into an agonizing dilemma. If they invoke their sacred collective defense treaties and strike back deep within Russian territory, they are consciously choosing to step onto that frictionless slope toward total incineration. How will an alliance built on institutional consensus and political theater react when the reality of hard power shatters their comfortable illusions? Will Western leaders maintain their defiant rhetoric when the abstract concept of war suddenly manifests as smoking craters on their own soil? During the Cold War, both Washington and Moscow operated with a profound sense of caution because they respected the destructive potential of the weapons they held. They understood that any direct clash, even at a conventional level, carried the inherent risk of spiraling into a global cataclysm. Today, that wisdom has completely evaporated, replaced by a generation of political elites who treat geopolitical strategy like an internet game where actions carry no permanent consequences. They have convinced themselves that they can actively assist in strikes against Russia's strategic bomber forces and sponsor territorial incursions while remaining completely immune to retaliation. This asymmetric assumption is a fatal flaw in Western planning. The Russian leadership is acutely aware of this psychological gap, and their internal debates reflect a growing consensus that only a profound physical shock will restore the structural equilibrium of deterrence. It's a terrifying realization that the world's safety now hinges on whether one side can scare the other back into sanity before the escalation ladder runs out of rungs. Let's look closely at the mechanics of an Article 5 crisis. Western commentators talk about Article 5 as if it were an automatic mathematical law of nature. They assume that if a Russian conventional missile hits a base in Poland, the entire Western world will instantly mobilize for total war. But this is a profound misunderstanding of treaty obligations and human psychology under the shadow of nuclear weapons. If Russia executes a limited conventional strike on Romanian or Polish territory and explicitly couples it with a warning that the next step is nuclear, the political solidarity of NATO will evaporate in an instant. What will the French or the British public say when they realize their own cities could be incinerated to avenge a targeted strike on an Eastern European logistics hub? The structural reality of international relations is governed by self-preservation, not by ink on parchment. In my view, when the illusion of total security is shattered, The immediate instinct of rational actors is not escalation, but panic management. The incentives to step back from the edge and find a diplomatic mechanism to diffuse the crisis are overwhelming. Consider the actual choice facing a U.S. president. If Russia uses, say, 6 tactical nuclear weapons in an unpopulated area or a purely military target as a demonstration of resolve, does the United States launch 6 nuclear weapons back at Russia? To do so would be an act of deliberate national suicide. The United States would be transforming a localized European crisis into a terminal event for Western civilization. In the cold, unyielding logic of game theory, the state that strikes second has no structural incentive to retaliate if that retaliation guarantees its own total destruction. The primary goal becomes stopping the madness immediately, ending the conflict, and accepting whatever territorial or political concessions are necessary to preserve survival. This is precisely the foundation of the strategy being discussed in Moscow. Strategists like Karaganov understand that the West's entire posture is built on a bluff, the belief that they can wage a proxy war with zero risk to their own domestic sanctuary. By forcing the West to choose between backing down or facing mutual annihilation, Russia effectively calls that bluff. How can an alliance of disparate nations, each with its own domestic vulnerabilities and political fractures, maintain a unified front when the price of admission is total destruction? The truth is that the Americans are already looking for ways to diminish their structural liabilities in Europe. The geopolitical center of gravity is shifting toward the Indo-Pacific, and the American political establishment has grown increasingly weary of carrying the security burden for a continent that refuses to defend itself. Washington is not going to sacrifice New York or Los Angeles for the sake of maintaining a sphere of influence in Eastern Europe. Yet, the danger remains that Western capitals are currently populated by ideological zealots who lack any historical memory of the Cold War. There is a terrifying contingent of political elites in Washington, London, and Paris who are so consumed by their own moralizing rhetoric that they might react with blind fury. They will scream about international law, democracy, and the credibility of the alliance, demanding an immediate retaliatory strike to punish Russian audacity. But who exactly will carry out this retaliation? The vast majority of NATO members have no strategic depth and no independent capability to project power at that level. The burden of decision falls entirely on the nuclear-armed states, the United States, the United Kingdom, and France. When the moment of truth arrives, the serious military and intelligence officials in those nations will look at the escalation matrix and realize that victory is structurally impossible. Pause twos. You cannot achieve a meaningful victory in a nuclear war. There's no scenario where the West can launch a counterstrike that leaves it in a superior strategic position. Every path leads back to the same terminal conclusion. This structural asymmetry gives the Russian Federation a tremendously powerful hand to play. They are operating on their own doorstep, defending what they perceive as their vital existential security perimeter. The West, by contrast, is engaged in an optional project of imperial expansion and geopolitical management. When the stakes are asymmetric, the side with the higher resolve, the side that views the conflict as a matter of national life or death, will always be willing to take greater risks. Emphasis. The West has spent decades assuming it has a monopoly on escalation, believing it could turn the economic and conventional screws indefinitely without triggering a physical reaction. That era of unearned security is over. If the Western establishment refuses to learn this lesson through diplomacy, they will be forced to learn it through the terrifying geometry of a real-world demonstration where the price of miscalculation is the end of the modern world. If we venture into the territory of what a physical manifestation of this strategy would actually look like, we must discard the apocalyptic imagery of popular culture. A demonstrative strike would not mean the immediate vaporization of a major European metropolis. If pushed pushed to this extreme, Russian military doctrine and the planners behind it would seek to minimize immediate casualties while maximizing psychological impact. We are looking at the deployment of a low-yield tactical nuclear weapon over an isolated military zone, an open body of water, or an unpopulated area. The objective is not mass slaughter. It is the sheer, undeniable fact of the weapon's physical use. It is designed to shatter the comfort of Western publics and policymakers, forcing them to instantly realize that the abstract academic exercises of escalation management have suddenly transformed into a tangible reality. Can anyone truly comprehend the psychological shift that would occur the morning after a nuclear weapon is detonated in anger for the first time in generations? Pause twos. The mere detonation would instantaneously re-establish the structural boundaries of deterrence that the West has spent decades trying to dismantle. This calculated approach is exactly what underpins the public strategic maneuvers we are seeing from figures like Karaganov. Many in the West dismiss his declarations as Kremlin-directed propaganda, but the reality is far more nuanced. Strategists of his vintage are not mere mouthpieces. They are independent, deeply influential thinkers who have spent their entire careers analyzing the cold mechanics of global power. Karaganov speaks his mind, often challenging the official line, and the Kremlin values this intellectual honesty. While his arguments for a preemptive strike initially shocked the Russian elite and placed him in a distinct minority, the relentless march of Western escalation has shifted the internal consensus. Today, his ideas are no longer viewed as radical fringe theories. They are increasingly seen as a prescient diagnosis of a structural breakdown in communication. For the Russian leadership, allowing these debates to take place in the public sphere serves a vital strategic purpose. It sends an unvarnished signal to Western capitals that the patience of the Russian state is finite and that the internal momentum within Moscow is shifting toward an uncompromising stance. We cannot ignore the immense domestic pressure bearing down on the Russian presidency itself. The Western media likes to project an image of an unconstrained autocrat, but the structural reality of the Russian state is highly complex. There is a deep-seated and growing resentment within the Russian political establishment, the military high command, and the broader intelligence apparatus. These factions believe that the Kremlin has conducted this conflict with an unnecessary degree of restraint, treating the Western presentation of threat with far too much leniency. They look at the continuous flow of Western weaponry, the intelligence sharing, and the direct strikes inside their territory, and they demand a response that matches the gravity of the challenge. This internal pressure means that the current leadership is constantly being pushed to abandon its incremental approach and deliver a decisive, paradigm-shifting blow. When a state's internal political dynamics align with an existential external threat, the margin for diplomatic maneuver shrinks to near zero. Why do Western planners continue to operate under the assumption that time is on their side when the internal clock of their adversary is ticking toward a radical break? This brings us to the broader philosophical reflection on the state of our world. We are living through the painful, chaotic transition away from a unipolar order that refused to acknowledge its own limitations. For over 3 decades, the Western establishment operated under the assumption that its power was absolute, its values universal, and its strategic dominance permanent. They forgot that the long sweep of international relations is defined not by permanent hegemony, but by the rise and fall of great powers, each bound by the timeless laws of sovereignty and self-preservation. By treating the security architectures of other nuclear superpowers as negotiable or irrelevant, the West has undermined the very mechanisms that prevented global catastrophe during the dark days of the 20th century. The current crisis is not a temporary aberration. It is a structural correction, a brutal reminder that a multipolar world cannot be managed through coercion and hubris. Emphasis. The choices facing powerful nations today are stark. Either they accept the reality of shared power and legitimate spheres of influence, or they persist in a delusional quest for absolute dominance that can only end in the ultimate tragedy of mutual destruction. As we stand on the precipice of this new and highly volatile global architecture, we must ask ourselves the questions that our leaders seem too timid to confront. If Western elites continue to ignore the structural red lines of a nuclear superpower, at what point does their collective hubris transform from a strategic miscalculation into an act of irreversible civilizational suicide? Are the nations of the West truly prepared to risk everything they have built over centuries for the sake of maintaining an artificial hegemony over borders they cannot realistically defend? What do you think will happen next? Let me know in the comments below.